Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. We're just going to let a few more folks join, and we'll be getting started momentarily. Thank you. All right, we're going to get started. Once again, thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Nick Kaza, and I work on energy and sustainability programs at the National League of Cities. Today, we're going to be covering best practices in solar energy planning and zoning. We have three fantastic presenters. Brian Ross from the Great Plains Institute will talk about incorporating solar energy into your community's plans. James Schroll from the Solar Foundation will discuss accessory use solar in your zoning code. And Megan Day from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory will highlight land use considerations for large-scale solar. Before we get started with today's presentations, I'd like to review some webinar details. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be able to share that once we're finalized. We will have some polling throughout the webinar for attendees to respond to, and all attendees are muted and will be muted throughout the webinar. After our speakers have concluded their presentations, we will have time for a brief Q&A. Please submit questions to the organizer through the chat feature in GoToWebinar, or you can email me at kaza@nlc.org. Before we begin, we're going to have a quick poll question. Let me see if this is going to work. Launch. All right. So we'd like to know who's joining us, where you're joining us from today. So please take a moment and respond to the poll. All right, thank you very much for everybody that has responded. Let's see. Close that poll. And let me just share the results real quick with everybody. So the majority of folks are joining us from a city, and then that's second to other, but then we also have quite a few folks from county, regional organizations, and a couple joining us from solar development companies. So thank you all for joining today's webinar. As you may know, this webinar is brought to you by the SolSmart program. SolSmart is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy and promotes the use of best practices by local governments to ensure that their processes are solar friendly. For those attending today's webinar or those that review this training at a later date, they will receive PZD-9 credit with the SolSmart criteria, and that is train staff on best practices in planning and zoning for solar PV. As I said, SolSmart is funded by the Department of Energy, and it's a national designation and technical assistance program. We designate communities as gold, silver, and bronze communities based on a tiered structure that looks at accumulated points and a certain number of prerequisites that are completed. And to help communities either achieve designation or move to a higher designation, we have a team of organizations that provide technical assistance to local governments, helping them improve their local processes, review local processes, and making them more solar friendly. We'll take a look at our designees from around the country. We can see that we're pretty spread out throughout the lower 48 right now. Currently, we have 229 designated communities well on our way to our goal of 300, and we've kind of set an internal team goal to hopefully move beyond that 300 by the end of the DOE grant. The SolSmart program provides assistance to enhance local solar markets, ideally making it easier and more affordable for homes and businesses to, slides got messed up there, making it easier and more affordable for homes and businesses to go solar. Along with that, it really promotes local jobs, helps communities achieve their climate and energy goals, improves internal processes to help them become more efficient and well-defined. And at the end of the day, if you are a SolSmart designated community, you get a great looking plaque as well that you can hang up at City Hall or your sustainability office. Before we jump to our first presenter, we're going to have another poll question. This one's specifically about solar in your comprehensive plan. All right, I can see the results coming in, and it looks like about 50% or over 50% say no. The comprehensive plan does not address solar. 16% or so say yes, it does, and about 1/3 say they don't know if their plans address solar energy. So I'm going to close the poll right now and turn over controls to our first presenter, Brian Ross at the Great Plains Institute. All right, Brian, you should have control. Please remember to unmute yourself before you begin.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Loud and clear.
All right. Welcome everyone. I'm gonna kick things off and talk about planning, the planning element of solar development at the community scale. Setting the stage for my colleagues who are going to talk about the development regulation part. Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit organization that works based out of Minneapolis, but works largely in the upper Midwest, but some issues nationally, and we've been doing a lot of work with the SolSmart program since it was founded. And so I'm going to start with my conclusions here. So just in case I run out of time, you haven't missed anything important. Anyway, so if you just remember one thing, really, it's that good plans enable good development, and that applies for solar energy just like it would for any other kind of development. But kind of the subcomponents of that are that solar energy, you need to remember, is an economically valuable local resource, and we have to think about it that way rather than thinking about it as a niche kind of environmental thing that some people in the community do. If your community had oil, and some of your communities probably do, you would think about it as an economically valuable resource that you need to plan for the development of, regardless of whether or not you're an oil fan. And the same thing happens with solar energy. Second, you need to recognize that the development of valuable resources in the community, like any kind of solar, like any kind of resource, should benefit the owner of that resource, but also the community. That's why we do planning, and that's why we do development regulations in many cases, is to make sure that as development occurs, it occurs in a way that benefits the community and minimizes risks. And then third is that local plans really lay the policy foundation for all of the development regulations and programs that you put in place to enable the capture of benefits of development while minimizing risks. And this is certainly true for solar development, and one of the things that we hope to do today is to lay the foundation so that you can understand how different forms of solar development have different risks and different benefits, and how you can capture some of those in your development regulations and programs. So one of the things that we do encounter frequently, and we saw that in the poll results, is that most comprehensive plans nowadays generally still do not include energy or cover it in any meaningful way. However, this is something that is pretty much becoming a necessity as things like solar energy, local resources become more viable. And there's three kinds of plans generally that three kinds of ways in planning that you can address solar energy or energy generally, and we would recommend here that you do it in all three of these. One is your general plan or your comprehensive plan, which is the big picture policy foundation for your development regulations and your programs and your investments in your community. The second is in your sub-area or specific area plans, where you're going to a greater level of granularity and doing more master planning and design elements that with some specificity in them. And there's still a role for discussing energy and solar energy in those plans. And then in functional plans, meaning things like transportation plans, water plans, or as we are seeing increasingly, things like climate action plans or energy plans that communities are putting together in order to guide development on those kinds of issues in their community. There's a role for solar in all of those kinds of plans, and you need to think about it because it is a resource that is impacted by all of those issues. When we talk about generally in the SolSmart program and in the work that we've done, our organization in the Midwest, we talk about there are 5 principles of a solar-ready community, and that really comes down to if you are a community that's solar-ready, you have a comprehensive plan that describes your solar resources and encourages development. You've addressed explicitly in your development regulations the different kinds of development that solar development can take. From a rooftop system to a solar farm, those are very different types of land uses, even though they're both solar, and your development regulations needs to acknowledge that. You need to address this in your permitting processes, making sure that they're transparent, predictable, and well documented. The SolSmart program can provide a lot of guidance on that. You need to do public sector investment in your community's own solar energy resources in your public facilities, and you need to think about your local programs, in particular things like your economic development programs, about how you can incorporate solar development into those programs the same way you would if it was housing development or commercial development. So I'm going to focus on the first one of those points, which is the comprehensive plan point. And we have 4 kind of points that we want to see in a comprehensive plan that communities address solar energy. And one is first you need to identify and define your solar resource. It is a mappable resource. It is a measurable resource. It has economic value, just like just as if it were vacant land in your community or water or any of the other kinds of things that you can map. That is a recognized resource. You need to acknowledge solar development in your plan, the kind of benefits that come from that you want to capture for the community. That's very important. You need to identify how solar development has both opportunities and conflicts as a land use within the communities, and do some proactive discussion and decision making about how you want to address that, particularly on the siting decisions that you're going to make for different types of solar development. And then third, you really should set development goals or targets for solar energy, just like you would, and you probably do in your plan already for things like housing. You want to know how many units of housing you're going to need. In your transportation plans, you talk about how many miles of bike lane you want to develop. Solar energy is no different from that, and you can and should set development goals. And I'm going to run through here some examples of different communities that have actually done these 4 points. And the first one I'm starting with is the Metropolitan Council in my home area of the Minneapolis-St. Paul region in Minnesota. There is a state statute that requires all local governments in their comprehensive plans to address the protection and development of solar resources. The council has, in the most recent round, actually helped those communities by identifying the solar reserve for each one of those communities, both the gross solar reserve and the rooftop solar reserve, and putting a quantifiable number on it and providing a map so that every community can see where the solar resource is in their community and address it in their land use plans and in their housing plans and their other development. And then third, the council developed some guidance on how to set goals for different types of communities, whether you were a rural community or an urban community, whether you were a township or a city. The council came up with examples of how in the market that we have in Minnesota, you can address this in your comprehensive plan, identifying and defining the solar resource in your comprehensive plan. And as an example of this, we have a map for the city of St. Louis Park. Whoops, sorry. You can see the gross reserve here, which is approximately, if every bit of economic solar resource was developed, it would be about 940 megawatts of generating capacity. If you looked at just the rooftops, it would be about 170 megawatts. To those of you who know energy, that's a whole lot of energy. The 940 is equivalent to a big coal-fired power plant. And the actual energy that could be developed or generated by the rooftop solar reserve is roughly equivalent to about 43% of the annual electric use in that community. So that gives you an idea of the size of it and the magnitude. And if you wanted to set a goal of 10% of your community, you can see that it should be easily achievable. The second point about comprehensive plans is acknowledging the benefits and co-benefits of solar energy in your plan. And one example of that is that solar development, like other development, provides community economic benefits. And the Solar Foundation has this great report called the Solar Job Census that breaks it out by state, the kind of solar development or employment growth associated with solar development that you can take a look at. But kind of acknowledging in your plan that this is a job creation strategy, it's an expansion of markets for your local contractors, there's economic benefits and diversity of income to landowners, and there's also an import substitution benefit. And just as an example of a community that has done this, I pulled up one of our SolSmart Gold communities of Pima County, Arizona, and I did cheat a little bit here because I infringed on Megan's ground to talk about a zoning issue, but this is kind of one way that they implemented their comprehensive plan by actually creating in their plan a land use district for a renewable energy incentive district, where they actually want to see, from an economic standpoint, solar energy and actually wind energy in this case, developed on appropriate lands in Pima County. They have identified where they want to do it and where they don't want to do it. And then some of the other kind of co-benefits you might want to think about are lessons that we've learned from incorporating natural systems into other forms of development, that we can also apply this to solar development as well. If we do development right, solar development right, we can capture things, for instance, like habitat value by incorporating pollinator friendly landscaping and ground cover into the development itself, and requiring developers to meet those standards. This also addresses water quality protection. By replacing marginal cropland and creating buffers, you can actually turn your solar development into a stormwater amenity if the soil types are appropriate, and you can certainly do a better job of probably addressing stormwater than most of the other forms of development that it's taking the place of. And then third, you can do things like integrating agricultural practices into your development standards, and Megan is going to talk about that and some of the interesting work that National Renewable Energy Lab has done to implement that. The third part of the comprehensive plan is to identify the opportunities and conflicts that, from a land use standpoint, that come around with solar development. Recognizing here that solar development is not one type of land use, but several different types of land use, and they address different kinds of resources and have either perceived or real nuisances. A lot of communities are currently dealing with the dilemma of perceived conflict with things in their community. For instance, agricultural practices. You're putting solar onto prime farmland, and that's a problem. Well, it might be a problem, but there are ways to mitigate that. But you first had to identify that in your comprehensive plan as an issue or not an issue for solar development in your community. At the distributed scale or at the accessory use scale, things like conflicts with historic resources or community character, neighborhood design standards. How does solar fit in with things like airports? Can you do solar around or within natural areas? These are questions that the easy reaction is just to say we're going to keep them out of those areas, but in fact you're losing opportunities if you do that, and you have to recognize that the different kinds of solar development have different impacts and different interactions with the existing land uses in your community. And that agricultural protection is one of those in particular, where when we look at agriculture protection, it takes a lot of different forms. including the 5 bullets that are up here on the screen: loss of prime ag soils, fragmentation of land, minimization of nuisances that impact agricultural practices by having, for instance, housing or incompatible forms of development in your ag areas. Solar development will have a greater or less impact on these different ag protection goals, and you need to think about that, because there's actually ways that you can do solar development that will enhance this agricultural protection rather than minimize it, and to take those opportunities. An example of a community that's done that is in Minnesota, is Stearns County, and this is their comprehensive plan goals, where they both acknowledge the reasonable and responsible use of natural resources in renewable energy, solar and wind, but they also have a goal about protecting agricultural and natural resources in the development process. And they have integrated these 2 goals into their development regulations in a very successful manner, and they have a great deal of solar in Stearns County while they are also protecting their agricultural resources. And the final point about comprehensive plans, about what you need to do, is to incorporate and set solar development targets or goals in your plan. And here I'm giving an example of another SolSmart Gold community, the town of Fairfield, Vermont. And this is actually in their sustainability plan rather than their comprehensive plan, so it's more of a functional plan. But still, they have set some very specific goals, both a 2020 kind of plan goal where they're getting 40% of the town's electricity from renewables. They want to see 500 residents with solar power at their homes, including low-income customers. And then they have a longer-term goal of 100% energy in the town by 2050. So these are the kinds of goals that actually, especially the last one there, that is at the scale of the comprehensive plan and can be incorporated into the plan in that manner. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm going to hand it back to Nick.
All right, thank you very much, Brian. I'm going to take control here again and share another poll question. Give me one moment while I bring that up. So, launching this poll question is about solar in your zoning code or your land use ordinance. Basically, is solar addressed in either of those codes or documents? So we have about 75% of the people voting. 41% say yes it is, 36% say no, and 23% say I don't know. And that's been fairly consistent since the voting started. So I'm going to close voting in one moment, and we will move on to our next presenter, James Schroll from the Solar Foundation, who will talk about accessory use solar in your zoning code.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Nick. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, and I am going to make you presenter right now. You have control.
Excellent. All right. So thank you all for your time today. My name is James Schroll. I'm a senior project manager at the Solar Foundation, and I work on SolSmart. The Solar Foundation is the lead on the technical assistance portion of SolSmart. We work with the NLC, where Nick works. We also work with the National Renewable Energy Lab, where Megan Day works, and you'll hear from her after me. We also have the opportunity to work with Brian Ross and folks at GPI and other parts of technical assistance. So I'm going to be talking about solar in your zoning code. We hear from a lot of communities that they don't address solar in their zoning code, so they don't have any barriers to solar. So SolSmart doesn't believe that not addressing solar in your zoning code isn't a barrier, and neither does the American Planning Association. So as you can see from the slide here, a conspicuous silence on the part of local policies, plans, and regulations on the topic of solar energy constitutes a significant barrier to adoption and implementation of these technologies. We'll get into this a little bit, but kind of the key here is if you don't kind of outline how you want this done, it would be very easy for a neighbor to come up to a property owner and say, you installed solar, you didn't have any right to do that, and could sue the city or county for kind of not providing that guidance or that regulation in the zoning. So we will get into some of the zoning topics here. All right. We won't be able to cover kind of everything necessarily that's covered in this list. This should be available, I think, afterwards if folks want it, but kind of covers most of the zoning topics that we're going to kind of cover in terms of best practices for small scale solar and how you might address them in your zoning ordinance. So let's get into the first one. So the first one is definitions. And so in terms of definitions, we would encourage local governments to have a broad definition for solar energy, including things like collection, storage, distribution, thinking about heating, cooling, electricity, water heating, also making sure that your definition incorporates balance of system equipment, so things like racking, inverters. Also, as you're developing your definitions, think about different scale definitions. So having a small scale, medium scale, large scale definition so that you're regulating impact of the size of the system in terms of square feet and not in terms of system capacity, not in terms of kilowatts, as efficiency can change. So we would encourage you all to think about regulating impact and not kind of kilowatt size capacity. We'll get into this more in a moment. But also encourage communities to not, encourage communities to think about how they're regulating installations on flat roofs. So we see a lot of communities, like the Denver example here, that have a solar panel flush mounted requirement because they're thinking about pitched roofs only. But we do have lots of installations on flat roofs, as the picture here shows. And those installations need additional height to be most efficient. They're typically at an angle, as is shown here. And so they need additional height and won't be flush mounted to be the most efficient. The Denver example, it also only allows a foot above the roof surface, and it would not allow for the kind of installation is shown here in the Gardner, Massachusetts example, which is clearly more than a foot above the roof surface. So we would encourage communities, flush mounted is fine on pitched roofs, but think about how you would want to have installations on flat roofs, and also noting that, again, they need to be done at a little bit at an angle and they need to have some additional height. We're going to talk about height in a moment, so we can get into that more. The second best practice is allowing solar as a by right accessory use in your zoning ordinance. So why is that an important feature? Well, requiring a conditional or special use permit would certainly add time and cost to the installation. And so that's something that would sort of disincentivize accessory use solar. We'd encourage your small scale systems, your accessory use systems to be permitted by right, and in residential zones, your kind of small and medium ones to be permitted by right in your non-residential zones, and then large ones could be considered by a special or conditional use permit, recognizing that there are some more issues at play there, and also kind of the medium scale ground mounted systems might require a conditional or special use permit in residential zones, and that's certainly appropriate. So kind of how do you operationalize that? How do you make that happen? Well, one way is the example here, the use table, and this one from Garfield County, Colorado, aligns with that kind of recommendation. You can see the different rows here for the accessory, small and large systems, and how it aligns with the different review processes. Another option, if you have a text-based ordinance, is just to list them out. So under all your accessory use portions of your code for each zoning district, acknowledging that solar is an accessory use if it's a small system, and then kind of where it might require additional review, either conditional or special use permit for some of the larger systems. Okay, we're kind of back to height. So as I mentioned, solar does usually require to be installed at an angle, at a tilt on flat roofs. So the best practice here is to exempt roof-mounted systems on flat roofs from height calculations, or allowing systems to exceed the maximum height by about 5 to 10 feet. So there's different ways to do this. So Freeport, Illinois has allowed for an additional 15 feet above the existing roof line, and it doesn't count PV systems towards the height computation. So this is one way to do it, and allows a community to have control over the size of that allowance. Certainly one way to do it. Another way we see frequently is that solar energy systems are kind of lumped into rooftop appurtenances. It's kind of how Lebanon, New Hampshire did it. They allowed solar systems, among other kind of rooftop appurtenances, to exceed the maximum height limit, but not by more than 20%. In some places in the country, they're just exempted from height, but you can see there's different ways to sort of achieve a similar goal. I don't have a slide on ground-mounted height. We could certainly answer questions about that, but that's something else to think about, is sort of how you would, if you want to allow for ground-mounted systems, thinking about the height there. We can certainly answer that in questions. Setbacks. So setbacks are certainly an important consideration if you're trying to increase the adoption of ground-mounted systems. And so the best practice here is to allow some flexibility in with the placement of solar ground-mounted systems, particularly allowing a modest encroachment into the setback for solar. So this would allow greater flexibility for the placement. It may help mitigate against shading in a yard, things like that, to help ensure that systems are viable when they're installed. And you can see some example code language here from Massachusetts. There's a Massachusetts Model Energy Solar Energy Code. This allows sort of no closer than half the setback, and you could certainly specify a certain number of feet in encroachment in the setback, and we often see that. Another issue that can face ground-mounted systems is lot coverage or impervious surface calculations. And so if a lot is at or near the impervious surface or kind of lot coverage maximum, and ground-mounted systems are counted as lot coverage, that could limit the places where solar ground-mounted systems could be installed. So we would certainly encourage communities to exempt ground-mounted systems from lot coverage or impervious surface requirements, as long as the ground beneath those systems is pervious. So grass would certainly be an example of that. That's the recommendation here from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. All right. Aesthetics is a big one we often see in zoning ordinances. Local governments certainly have a desire to regulate aesthetics. It's a large portion of what a zoning ordinance does. We would encourage local governments to not have aesthetic regulation affect the functionality or kind of economics of a solar energy system. And so we would encourage communities to not limit its visibility from public rights of way. Particularly, that can be an issue if the street side is the south-facing side, and that's always the most efficient as long as it's not shaded. We would encourage communities not to exempt solar from screening requirements, particularly as that adds cost, but it can also shade solar energy systems. So we would encourage some caution in terms of aesthetics, aesthetic regulation. Okay, historic and special use districts can provide an interesting challenge, but also a great opportunity. So I did mention aesthetics just now and height requirements. So historic and special use districts, maybe viewshed areas, things like that. These are places in your community where you can obviously have additional regulation and often do have design guidelines. And we certainly would, not want those historic characters, those areas altered. But we would encourage communities kind of to follow best practice of providing some guidance about how solar could be installed within those districts while still preserving the historic character or the special use district. So the example in the slide is from Plano, Texas. This is policy. It's not zoning ordinance language, but certainly something to consider. The different guidance you want to provide in terms of where the placement on the site, whether it has to be behind a parapet wall or not obscuring a significant feature, kind of shown in the image on the right, or maybe it's installed on a non-contributing structure or a secondary structure on a site. Does it need a certificate of appropriateness? You might want to outline these steps so that an owner of a historic property could still install solar while, again, maintaining historic character. Another issue lots of communities kind of run into is how you install solar on a non-conforming property or non-conforming use. So, most communities do want non-conforming structures to become conforming, but we would encourage communities to allow solar to be installed on a non-conforming use as long as that non-conformity is not increased. So kind of providing that specificity would be useful. Broward County, an example here, does that. And something you could kind of incorporate into your zoning language as well. So the last issue here that I'd like to talk about before passing it back to Nick is glare. We often see requirements for glare studies or glare analysis in zoning ordinances. And so we would encourage communities not to require those unless solar is at or near an airport. The FAA does require that type of analysis if solar is installed near an airport. There's obviously many instances of solar being installed next to airports, and that's gone well. It's sort of a myth that solar photovoltaics do cause glare. Solar PV absorbs sunlight. They'd be very inefficient if they didn't do that and they reflected in sunlight. And solar PV actually causes less glare than windows and water. And so, again, we would encourage local governments to kind of not require that analysis in those studies unless they're near airports. There's some information here I would encourage you all to take a look at that NREL has put together on glare. So encourage you to take a look at that. looking forward to your questions, and thank you again for being here, and I'll pass it back to Nick.
Thanks, James. I will take control back and bring up another poll question that we have. This one is asking, what types of solar development have created conflict in your community? And this is a question you can select multiple answers. I'm going to keep collecting some of this poll data since it does have multiple answers. Just so everybody knows, we will be sharing the slides with everybody that's in attendance, hopefully to those that aren't in attendance as well. And then we will hopefully be able to post the recording of this webinar onto SolSmart's YouTube channel. So it's available for everybody to review and share with other members of their planning or zoning staff and or other communities that might be interested as well. Okay, I'm going to close this poll and just share the results real quick so everybody can see here. So it looks like types of developments that have created conflict. Luckily, almost half the people said none. I guess that's a very good sign right now. And then it's kind of a three-way tie between residential rooftop, community solar farms, and utility scale solar. So we are going to kind of transition into large-scale solar, and Megan's going to talk about key considerations that one should consider when looking at large-scale solar. Megan, you are now the presenter. Let me hide this poll. There we go. Go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Nick. So this is Megan Day with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, and I need to start with some...
Megan, can you share your screen, please? I don't see it yet.
Okay. I didn't see your pop-up. Where did it go? I'm going to keep looking for it. And
I'll take control back and then give you control again.
Okay.
All right, and there you go.
There it is. Sorry, I didn't see it at first. Okay. Here we go. Thanks. Look okay now?
Yep.
Okay, fabulous. All right, so I work with NREL, and we are one of 17 Department of Energy national laboratories. We are the only lab that is exclusively dedicated to research and analysis in renewable energy, energy efficiency, as well as sustainable transportation. And so we are obviously funded by the Department of Energy for the SolSmart program, and NREL is one of the technical assistance providers for the program. So I want to start off with what is large-scale PV. It's not a hard and fast definition that we're using here, but basically we're looking at ground-mounted systems that maybe are over 1 acre, say. And we're focused on photovoltaics, or PV, and that's a technology that converts sunlight into electricity through semiconductor materials. So we're not using turbines, and we're not talking about concentrating solar power, which generally uses mirrors, so that would create glare. So focus on PV, which is the vast majority of solar development that you'll see. And again, looking at larger scale systems, and just the rule of thumb that's good to keep in mind is that large scale systems require about 5 to 7 acres per megawatt of installed capacity. So you can measure in that way. And then generally, these systems are not going to be net metered, or the energy is not going to be consumed on site necessarily. It could be for a large facility like a factory, but not necessarily. So why should we plan for large-scale solar? I know a lot of you are probably facing some development pressures in your communities, but some of you may not be, and you may soon. So why is that? Well, if you look at the Department of Energy's Sunshot low battery storage cost scenario, which is a scenario that is rapidly becoming a reality as battery storage costs drop precipitously, they predicted that PV deployment would grow to an estimated 1,600 gigawatts by 2050. And that would require building an additional Massachusetts-sized amount of utility-scale ground-mounted solar. So that is in addition to rooftop that would be assumed to be part of that deployment. So in order to build Massachusetts' amount of solar, I think all of us are going to see some increased development over the next years and decades. Why is that? Also because we're seeing such crazy drops in the amount of the cost of solar energy, and also a lot of very ambitious goals. So we're seeing a lot of corporate procurement to meet 100% renewable goals. We're also seeing over 100 cities that have set 100% renewable goals, 11 counties, and 2 states and the District of Columbia have set 100% renewable goals. And that's in addition to state-level renewable portfolio standards and just the lower cost of PV. So PV is the second to lowest cost at utility scale for electricity generation right now, only second to wind. And it's compatible and competitive with new natural gas facilities and generally lower cost than existing coal generation at this point. So we're going to see a lot of development pressure. So what kind of benefits might you gain from that kind of development in your community? Brian touched on some of these, but we're going to see a lot of economic development as a result of large-scale solar development. And that would include jobs primarily during construction. There is not much for on-site jobs after construction, but also spending. So that's during the development and also the operation and maintenance phase. And increased local property taxes during the operation and useful life of that facility. You will see a significant increase in revenues from taxation. It improves energy security, so you don't need fuels, you don't need a pipeline to deliver that oil, you don't need gas pipelines where you face the risk of explosions. It is a local power generation source, and so you don't have shipping or purchasing of fuels. And it also reduces environmental risk associated with fossil fuels like mining, coal ash, greenhouse gases, mercury, etc. So those are some of the benefits that can come from large-scale PV. So how do we address this in the zoning code? This is basically a repeat of what James presented here. But the key part here is you want to regulate large-scale ground-mounted solar in 2 different ways. First, differentiate by size. Again, not capacity as in kilowatts or megawatts, because efficiencies change over time, and the size and the footprint of that system will shrink as modules become more efficient. So you want to regulate it based on its impact, which is roughly correlated to size or footprint. And so distinguish between large scale, maybe medium scale and small scale based on the footprint, and then further distinguish between rooftop and ground mounted, because you don't want to regulate a small several panel background or backyard sort of application or ground mounted system in the same way that you would a solar farm. Just because it's ground mounted doesn't mean it has the same kind of impact. Also, I would discourage you from considering utility scale solar as an industrial land use. I do see this sometimes, you look out over a solar farm and it looks like a pretty intense land use. However, it doesn't have the same kind of characteristics as an industrial land use. For example, a solar farm does not create noise, traffic, or pollution in the same way that an industrial land use is expected to. Also, I have seen utility-scale solar farms be zoned as large-scale in power generation facilities, right? So you're regulating it in the same way you might a gas turbine plant or a coal plant. And that's also inappropriate because you don't have the same kind of impacts. You don't need substantial amount of water for steam turbines and for cooling. You don't have a lot of on-site personnel or any. And you don't need fuel delivery via railroad or pipeline. You don't need gas delivery. You don't need a mainline extension for water delivery. So you don't want to force PV to be developed on industrial land because it doesn't fit and it doesn't need those services. Nor do you want to do what amounts to spot zoning by requiring that land be rezoned to industrial to accommodate solar development, because at that point you're basically spot zoning by having this parcel that's probably out in the middle of nowhere. All of a sudden it's developed, it's zoned as industrial, and so that might not be, at the end of the useful life of your solar farm, a place where you would want an industrial use like a factory over the long term. So I would encourage you to allow solar energy, large scale included, in almost all of your zoning codes with a special or conditional use. So you can consider each development in its unique context and approve or disapprove and add conditions as is warranted. So again, there's a lot of myths surrounding large-scale PV in particular, and James talked a little bit about the glare. So again, less reflective than water or windows. PV modules will generally have an anti-reflective glass coating. Also, they're very low noise. So inverters make a small hum and tracking equipment will make a whir, but outside the fence line, it's generally equivalent to the ambient noise. So not a loud facility, it's a pretty quiet neighbor. These facilities are safe. They are warranted. Most of the equipment has a long-term warranty, and also they're going to meet electrical and building standards. And these are low voltage facilities. Sometimes folks are concerned about electromagnetic field or EMF impacts, and actually solar facilities, large scale as well, are lower voltage than your distribution or transmission lines that will be in your community. So not a concern there, again, if you're outside the fence line. As Brian said, there can be some development benefits, and it also depends on how you regulate these large-scale facilities and how you might capture those benefits. So if you encourage or require lower impact development practices, particularly in the terms of the ground cover and the vegetation management practices, you can capture water quality protection, habitat value, and agricultural opportunities as co-benefits to large-scale solar development. Also, vegetation provides some benefits to the photovoltaic system by lowering temperatures beneath the panels, which also increase efficiencies, and by reducing operation and maintenance costs. If you have a low growth, low height kind of vegetation cover, then that really minimizes the amount of mowing that you're going to need to do. And anytime you go out there with a mower, you're putting your panels at risk if you kick up a rock or something, and you also incur the costs of the labor and also the emissions from mowing. So here are some other kinds of co-benefits that you can capture from large-scale solar development, including developing on brownfields, which might not be able to be developed for anything else. There's been a lot of development on landfills as an example of brownfield development, and that's happening in Massachusetts, in New Jersey, and many other states where it does cost more. So don't expect that it's just going to be a great, easy win there, because it will cost more to develop on a landfill. You cannot just ram your posts into the ground. You have to place them in ballasts, which is a concrete sort of pier or foundation, so that you don't pierce the cap of the landfill. And you also have to do some pretty special geotechnical engineering for those roads, so you're not impacting the underlying landfill. But it is a great land use and co-benefit that you can capture. Another opportunity for low-impact solar development is requiring native grasses and forbs that can provide some habitat for native species, as well as you can see here, provide a lot more soil stabilization, erosion prevention, as compared to turf grass. Other pollinator-friendly practices that could be implemented as a co-benefit. Brian talked a little bit about this. In Stearns County, there are now 3 states that have established pollinator-friendly solar vegetation standards. And there are at least 2 counties who are requiring that for their large-scale solar installations, so that vegetation meet those standards. There's also the state of Oregon, which is looking at ways to preserve agricultural lands. And they're currently revisiting those. I think they're facing a lot of development on agricultural lands. So let's look at some ways that you can capture some co-benefits with agriculture from solar development. So NREL and Argonne National Laboratory has done some recent research that looked at the potential benefits to agricultural production from placing pollinator-friendly habitat and vegetation on solar farms. So we found that if 10 to 50% of the existing and planned solar farms had pollinator-friendly vegetation, that would enable an additional $1.9 to $5.7 billion in annual pollinator benefit annually. So that's captured in things like increased crop yield for the surrounding, within that sort of bee forage range, for example, the surrounding agricultural production in areas. So here you can see those states where there would be the highest impact in places like California and Minnesota from pollinator-friendly solar farms. And so particularly we see benefits for highly pollinator-dependent agricultural crops like almonds and cranberries, melons, apples, blueberries, plums, and the like. We took a quick look at a case study here in Minnesota on one solar facility. So if we planted that solar facility with, which I believe it actually is planted with pollinator-friendly vegetation, we took a hypothetical 1% pollinator service increase benefit, and the resulting, that yellow area is the agricultural production in the vicinity where the bees might forage and provide other pollinator benefits, that it adds by a magnitude of thousands of dollars to the agricultural production in the nearby areas. There's also opportunities to have agricultural benefits and activities right on the solar farm. And so that includes not just solar-friendly vegetation or pollinator-friendly vegetation, but also apiaries right on the solar farms and honey production. There's also a lot of sheep grazing as a vegetation management option, as well as, you're raising the sheep. These are generally sheep raised for meat. You can see they don't have horns, so they're not going to smash the panels. Goats don't work. They jump up and they eat everything, and they break the panels. But we've seen a lot of, especially in places like North Carolina, there's a lot of sheep grazing on solar farms as an agricultural co-benefit on those farms that also provides vegetation management. And then NREL has a number of test plots across the country and actually in India where we're growing crops right underneath the solar panels. And here's one in Massachusetts at UMass where we're growing hand-picked vegetables under the solar panels, and we've found that the shading from the panels does not significantly reduce the agricultural production in this case. So to summarize, it's important to include solar in your comprehensive plan by recognizing and quantifying your solar resource, establishing goals and objectives related to solar, and then in your zoning or land use code, it's important to, again, differentiate between rooftop and ground-mounted solar, as well as between small and large-scale PV, so that you can regulate it accordingly and streamline it and that development accordingly. It's also important to establish development standards that help achieve your comprehensive plan, solar goals, and objectives. There's a lot of options for attracting beneficial solar development to achieve those solar goals and objectives related to permitting and taxation. And there's also, certainly within the purview of planning and zoning, ways to consider ground cover standards and PV and agricultural co-benefits and even co-location. So that's all for me, and I am really looking forward to your questions, and I will turn it back over to Nick to moderate the Q&A session.
All right, thank you very much, Megan. I am going to share my screen again. We have one final poll question, and then as Megan said, we are going to get into some Q&A. So let me bring up the final poll question, which, as you could expect, is what type of assistance do you need? And you'll see that this is, again, select multiple answers. So I'll wait as we gather some of this feedback. So I'm going to wait as results are still coming in, but leading the way, well, there's two of them that are kind of leading the way right now. The first is addressing solar in kind of zoning code and land use ordinances. So James, I'll kind of want to tee you up, and basically, if a community is looking to start addressing solar for the first time, can you give them kind of a few key steps on, how they should go about doing that, slash what they should really be considering as they begin that process? And then after James is done answering that, we'll go to Brian because the next highest need for assistance is integrating solar into a comprehensive plan or other type of community plan. So just, again, kind of the same question. How should they really approach that? What should they be considering? Just kind of some key points there. So first, I'll let James kind of talk about addressing solar and zoning code.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So I'll start by saying through the SolSmart program, we are kind of happy to do zoning code review and code of ordinances reviews for folks, land use ordinance reviews, to help you kind of identify any barriers that might exist or gaps in your code. Also, Megan and I are happy to work with you on updates to your code if that's something your community is interested in doing. In terms of kind of first steps, would certainly encourage people to kind of think through how their code is put together. Some codes do specify specific accessory uses. Some, so they have an opportunity to kind of define solar as an accessory use and then go through the different zoning categories: residential, commercial, office, industrial, and specify that solar is a permitted accessory use there. And then also identify where they might want kind of the medium and larger scale systems as well. Some codes aren't put together that way. Some just define accessory uses but don't specify them. So in those instances, you might just have to define solar in your code as an accessory use because the different zoning categories, don't specify out which accessory uses are permitted. I would also kind of encourage communities to think about some of these additional pieces I went through about height and setbacks and lot coverage. I won't get into all that, but I would encourage people as they're going through this to think about where they might want to include some of those other solar best practices and think about how they might want to incorporate that into their code.
Perfect. Thanks, James. Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Nick. So integrating solar into the comprehensive plan or other plans, if you think about what a plan is, you have to identify your existing conditions, kind of where you're at now. You have to identify your desired conditions, where you want to be, and then you have to identify the strategies or strategy priorities about how to get from where you are to where you want to be. That's what a plan is, and integrating solar into your plan kind of takes the same process. You first need to identify what your existing conditions are, and that's understanding what the solar resource is. And that's kind of for a lot of people, that's the biggest single thing. They say, how on earth do I do that? How do I measure it? There are a number of resources out there by which you can get an estimate, either sometimes a fairly accurate estimate and other times more of a modeled estimate. But every city in the nation can reference, and Megan could talk to this at great detail, the state and local energy data source at the National Renewable Energy Lab, which provides an estimate of solar resources for every single city in the nation. There's also other forms of measurement that are a little bit more specific to the community. We have some communities that actually, some states that actually have done solar measurement across the entire state using LIDAR information and mapped it out in detail. State of Minnesota has done this. I know state of New York, I believe, has done it. State of Iowa has done it. And there's a GIS shapefile or raster file that you can get and clip it to your community to kind of do the measurements that you want to do. And then the third way, and it's easier than that, the GIS method is Google Sunroof, Project Sunroof under Google. Has mapped out for a large number of communities what the rooftop solar resource is. And if you just go to Google, if you Google Project Sunroof, it will take you there, and you can type in your community name, and it will kick up if it's covered. And they tend to only cover the urban areas of the nation. But that is also a resource to know where to get that. Where to get that solar existing condition kind of information from. And then the matter is of setting desired conditions. Once you know your existing conditions, you can be in a position to say, where do we want to go? And making sure that you're addressing in your plan both the kind of accessory use development that James talked about and the large scale development that Megan talked about is important for almost every community, because even in cities that are fairly densely developed, there are frequently opportunities to do large scale solar development on things like closed landfills or brownfields or buffer areas around industrial properties, and those kinds of things will come up eventually in your community, and you should probably think about that in your plan, because at some point someone's going to want to develop that valuable solar resource that's there, and you need to have a plan in place to do it. So anyway, that's a few kind of ideas about moving ahead with incorporated into your plan, and there are some written resources out there that have been developed, both that SolSmart can provide you, that are some of which are state specific. We have at Great Plains Institute developed solar guidance toolkits for 4 different states in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Iowa, that provides a little bit more detail on some of these things and the specific kind of enabling statutes and language that you want to go through and look at as a community.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brian. All right, I'm going to go through a couple of questions from the attendees. Bear with me as I kind of scroll through here. But the first one I'd like to ask says, in my locality, we have a lot of attached development, typically a common shared wall between the buildings. Do localities typically have setbacks from that common wall, at least for maintenance and access?
So this is James. They're talking about sort of an easement? Is that what I gather? I think some communities would have an easement there. Solar wouldn't obviously be appropriate to be installed on a municipal easement. I think that's sort of the easiest way to answer that question. There's other opportunities for communities that are in that kind of situation where there's lots of kind of multifamily property, maybe thinking through things like community solar, if that's an option where this individual lives, or kind of other siting. But Megan, do you want to jump in at all on that?
Sure. I think this could touch on 2 different issues. There's the solar access issue as well as the rooftop PV setback issue, and that's generally a fire code or your local fire department standard issue. And that can be a part of the fire code and building inspection, or it can be included in the zoning code. I've seen it in both instances. Some fire departments, and I encourage you to coordinate with your fire chief, will want a 3-foot setback from the edge of the roof space for fire access. Some fire departments don't care because they're not going to punch a hole in your ceiling or in your roof if there is a fire, and so they don't care if there's PV on top of the roof. So that can vary depending on the community and the various practices for fire prevention and fighting. But there's some best practices that we list in some of the resources from SolSmart on fire safety and standards and solar. So we also offer credit for training your fire and emergency responders to address situations where there is solar on a building. So we can provide some resources and technical assistance on that front. As far as solar access and shading of an adjacent property, there's also a number of resources on how to go about doing that. And there's sort of the level of your community's tolerance for regulation will dictate how much you want to get involved in solar access and protecting it. I've seen a 22-page solar access ordinance that specifically regulates, how solar can be built and the building regulations to avoid shading of existing and potential and planned solar. Or you can just say, okay, if you're going for a building permit, you have to make sure that it's not going to shade any existing solar facility, or you can do nothing. I mean, it's totally up to you. So that's kind of how some adjacent properties that are, in this case, built very closely together might impact solar access. So solar access can either be the access for an existing system, a planned system, or just the access to sunlight for a property. Lots of different definitions.
And
Excellent.
Brian, and I just wanted to add, and I don't know if the question was addressing this specifically, but obviously you see in common interest communities a lot of times townhome developments where there's similar issues, and those are then complicated by the fact that there's usually some kind of a design standard associated with that, and that's a whole other realm of addressing that kind of regulation at the local level. And I just wanted to mention it. I don't want to go down that path right now.
All right, thank you all for your feedback. Megan, I think this is probably a question that you can best answer, but what are the thresholds defining small, medium, and large-scale systems?
Well, in the definition we gave there were some examples of the square footage that you can use as rough guidelines. It's taken basically from the Massachusetts state guidelines for solar in your zoning code, and that's a very good resource. Now, you may not be anything like Massachusetts. You might be, Utah or Nevada, where there's a lot more land, and those scales are going to shift accordingly as far as the size. So it will depend on your particular land use and type and the kind of community you're in. But you can use those kind of thresholds as rough guidelines for determining what is small, medium, and large.
And this is Brian, and I'll just note that sometimes there's statutory definitions of things. We have seen, for instance, in several Midwestern states, community solar gardens have been enabled under state statute, and they have specific sizes. And they're unfortunately, from the standpoint of Megan's guideline, they're written in terms of megawatts rather than in terms of size. But nevertheless, obviously, a community solar garden in Illinois, I believe, is a 2 megawatt size garden, and that has a specific size, somewhere around 12 acres of land, and that would kind of become maybe your medium scale definition, because that's the kind of development you're going to be seeing in that place.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of jump on to what Brian is saying. Some of the utilities around the country also have definitions that they use for interconnection. So, and it's not just for community solar. So I know Florida, some of the Florida utilities are in that boat. So please also check with your utility as you're thinking through kind of your definitions.
All right, thank you. I think this is a good question. And again, I think Megan or some of your colleagues at NREL may have some resources here, but do speakers have resources for decommissioning and end-of-life PV for communities? Kind of the idea of repurposing the land or recycling requirements, best practices for decommissioning. Is that, guidelines that should appear in the land use ordinance?
Good question, and it often does include address decommissioning in the land use ordinance. You might be reassured to know that most leases for a land, if it's not purchased, will include decommissioning requirements. But oftentimes a land use ordinance for large-scale solar will include things like if the solar, and it includes this for rooftop as well, if the facility is not in operation for more than 12 months, then it must be decommissioned. And that some communities have a decommissioning bond or letter of credit or some other financial mechanism. Now, there's some controversy as to how much it actually costs to decommission a solar farm, and to what extent do you allow the commodities, the resources on that site, including the steel, the aluminum, and the copper, to be used to offset that decommissioning cost. So back in my day when I was a solar developer, we would often argue that, yes, just the value of that copper, solar, aluminum, and steel is going to offset any kind of decommissioning cost. Because you don't have, particularly if you have low-impact development practices and you haven't graveled the entire site and you haven't been putting herbicides and pesticides on that site for the life of the project or until it is decommissioned, then you have a viable site that can be returned or used for the first time for agricultural purposes. So you really just have to pull out the steel posts, and you can even leave the cabling underground because it's below the till depth, and you can use that site other than the roads and the pad mounted equipment areas for agriculture, and you can reclaim those areas if you want. So it's a very low-cost decommissioning project, and you can actually kill a project by requiring a very high value bond to be held for the entire life of the project. So it's a balance to be made, and there's a lot of controversy around it. I wish we had more resources, but we do have several that I think are up on the SolSmart site, and I can help deliver some that I've pulled together if you want to email me.
Excellent. Thanks, Megan.
And if I can just add one piece that we're starting to see now in some of the Midwestern states that we're working in is we actually have some communities that are thinking about solar development as a long-term rotational crop, where they're saying that if we put the solar development in a place and we require appropriate vegetation that's going to actually build soil content and restore it, and we think about it as a 25-year rotation, we can actually, at the end of that 25 years, even decommission that site, keep the same interconnection, go to an adjacent site, and then turn that land back into farmland, and you've just enhanced the soil content and actually created more of an agricultural resource. We've also seen a couple of communities that have similarly said, we ultimately think that land is going to be developed in housing, and we're going to develop it as an interim use, actually issue a 25-year interim use permit, where at the end of that 25 years, we'll decommission the site and open it up for development as we expand our urban growth boundary. So those are just kind of two, not directly related to decommissioning, but kind of reuse and recycling questions of the land. And then I think the question also did mention recycling, and there's and I don't know, Megan or James might be able to answer this better than I can, but there is a whole set of issues around recycling of the panels in the appropriate way and what that will mean in the future, and a standard that might want to be incorporated into an ordinance.
So just briefly on the recycling of the panels, the Solar Energy Industries Association, SEIA, does have a committee that is focused on how the industry does deal with recycling panels. So I encourage folks who are kind of interested in that to kind of look at SEIA resources on that matter.
And SEIA is the Solar Energy Industry Association?
Yep.
Yep, excellent. Okay, this is a little bit of a long question, but I think it's important to address. Do our speakers know of any communities successfully requiring installation of on-site solar PV in conjunction with private development applications? or communities offering meaningful incentives that are working to increase the number of private solar PV installations throughout their community. For this community, their code allows solar, but not many people are installing it, and they're interested in ideas for how to require it through development code, building code regulations, or other ways to possibly incentivize solar.
I think the first option that you might want to consider as a community is a Solarize program. And feel free to jump in, James or Brian, but basically Solarize is a bulk purchasing program that is facilitated by the city or county government, where you vet certain, any applicable installers, and you pick one or several which have been pre-selected, and then you basically have your community residents and businesses sign up for a bulk purchasing install. So there's a certain time frame in which the installs are made, and you get a bulk deal, right? A bulk purchase rate on that kind of installation. And we've seen a lot of success in Solarize programs across the country for really increasing solar energy deployment. Brian, you want to speak to that at all?
Well, actually, it was kind of funny. I went in a completely different way. I was thinking about how to incorporate solar-ready development into PUD requirements and things like that. But I think Megan's point is really good. That the cities and local governments actually have a whole host of tools available to them that they use for things like economic development that can be adapted for solar, to encourage solar development in the community. And the Solarize program is really a great example of that. And we've seen that in some of our communities. There was, for instance, in Urbana, Illinois, I know in a previous version of the SolSmart program, as a component of that, the team that was working with Urbana helped put together a Solarize program that they went from something like 5 or 6 installations in the city to something like 200 or 300 as a means of that, just by virtue of that bulk buy purchase and the publicity around it. But I did want to kind of just touch on that, the regulatory examples. There are a number of places where we're starting to see actual solar development or solar installations are required with new development. The city of Tucson was one of the leading examples of that, where they actually started requiring solar as part of every new residential home. But now, via the building code, the entire state of California has gone down that approach. Which is, of course, very big scale kind of development, and it's still somewhat controversial, but it is actually in place and is moving forward. And then there are some communities that have incorporated, for instance, solar, both either solar-ready development or solar actual development as a component of other kinds of flexible zoning standards, like planned unit developments, where if a developer chooses to go down that path, they must, for instance, install a certain number of solar arrays on the buildings, or to make a certain percentage of them solar ready so that they can be installed at some later point in time without great expense. So there are a number of tools that local governments have at their disposal to, depending on how far they want to go, if they want to do encouragement, if they want to provide an incentive, if they want to actually require it via regulation, you can go any one of those paths with solar. And there are some nuances about state law, different places where you're going to be limited in some states on some of those options, while in other ones it will be openly available. And that's actually something that SolSmart program deals with quite a bit, I think, on a community by community basis, and there's resources there.
Yeah, just a couple things to add. This is James. South Miami is another city that required solar on new construction. San Francisco required it in certain instances as well. And then, as Brian mentioned, there's always, an ability to sort of incent as opposed to require. So you could, allow for or provide additional density in exchange for a certain amount of on-site solar. So that could either be through floor area ratio or kind of units breaker, depending on how your ordinance or your zoning ordinances, zoning districts are set up. But there's certainly opportunities for that.
And I will just finally chime in and say that for some communities, not knowing where this particular question came from, but obviously working with your utility that is in your community is another way to enable more solar development to happen. We have seen some utilities that are very interested in being part of solar development, while others have erected barriers at the local level to solar development through things like fees assessed specifically to solar or households with or businesses with solar on them. So that's another place to look, just to make sure that and to work with your utility to make sure that that's not stymieing solar development from occurring.
Great, thanks, Brian. I think we have time for probably one more question here. Right now on the screen, I do have everybody's contact information. Feel free to reach out to any of our speakers individually. You can reach out to myself if you want to get more involved in the SolSmart program. If you're specifically looking to receive credit for PZD-9, please send me an email as well, and I will ensure that whoever your TA provider is aware that you attended the training. Our final question, I'm going to say it's not a little bit of a curveball, but it's something that I think more and more communities will be thinking about in the future is, are we seeing currently, or are there really any best practices yet established for battery storage within zoning codes or land use ordinances? Any types of standards or best practices to consider?
Good question.
I know of one best practice document, NYSERDA, so the New York State kind of Energy and Research Department, has put together some best practices, I believe, with CUNY, Sustainable CUNY. And so I would encourage folks to look at that. And Megan may know of some other ones. Megan and Brian may know of some other ones as well.
Right. I think what you saw in our definition is a very good start, which is to add the word storage to your solar energy. We like to encourage solar energy system as your definition, and then as part of that system, use the word storage, because I think you'll see it more and more in different systems that are being installed in your communities. So that can start you down that road. And then, again, I wish we had more, and I propose to do some more resources on this, but there are other resources from the New York City on permitting storage. They've had some struggles with their fire department as far as how to permit storage. As Brian has said in the past, you permit a storage like a wall mount in your garage storage equipment, like you would a dishwasher or something. It's internal to the building and part of your electrical system. Now, you might look at that differently if it's external and grid scale and large scale, and so that's a different consideration. You might want to look at some greater setbacks for safety, but there's been a lot of storage deployment that's gone on, and so we can email some storage examples out to those folks who have that question specifically. Brian, do you have anything to add?
Just one of the examples that I heard on storage at the residential scale is that people would talk about, well, what about all those the Tesla solar walls, right? The kind of batteries that come with the roof that they were marketing, which we have seen some deployment of, and whether or not there were any safety considerations in the home, and we had someone from Tesla who pointed out that the 10 kilowatt hour solar wall is really pretty much of not a consideration for safety when you think about the 100 kilowatt hour solar battery or battery that is in the Tesla car that's parked in the garage. So the scale of we sometimes forget that we have examples of risk in front of us that shed light on how to treat things like the solar wall. But the battery storage is really not a safety issue within the home, and we do have, like I just said, as we move to electric cars, far bigger batteries in the cars than probably we will ever have inside the home for home use.
Okay. I think with that, we are going to end the webinar. I just want to let everybody that's still here know that there will hopefully be a follow-up newsletter that we'll send out to, again, all attendees and those that registered. We'll include the slide deck, the webinar recordings, or a link to the webinar recording, and then we'll include some additional resources as well on things like storage in ordinances, decommissioning, pollinator habitats, solar and agriculture and how to balance that, and then some guidelines for solar and comprehensive plans as well. So we may not be able to get that out until sometime early or mid next week, but that will definitely be in your inbox at some point. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar, and I would also like to thank our three presenters. I think they did a great job, and a silent round of applause for them. With that, enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everybody.